In my 2018 Game of the Year video, I bemoaned the lack of great AAA games from that year. 2018 had plenty of excellent indies, so I wasn't disappointed with the quality of games overall. However, with the exception of God of War, most big budget games felt uninspired and generally mediocre. I'd seen it all before, and far too often I knew exactly how the game would play out before I even booted it up and started moving through the motions of getting from beginning to end. And that's for the games which actually have endings, something that is becoming increasingly rare these days. In that Game of the Year video, I went as far as to say that perhaps AAA games just weren't for me anymore. I released that video on January the 14th. 11 days later, Capcom released its remake of Resident Evil 2, a phenomenal survival horror game, possibly the best one ever, and a game that raises the bar for the genre. Unsurprisingly, I'm giving Resident Evil 2 5 stars out of 5, and I fully expect this to be a contender for my 2019 Game of the Year. Perhaps coincidentally, my 2018 Game of the Year was also a January release. Let me start by disclosing my bias up front, because Resident Evil 2 certainly holds a significant place in my memories. The original Resident Evil 2, released back in 1998, was my first Resident Evil game. I was only 15 at the time, and it was rare for me to buy a game for full price. However, I read a couple of glowing reviews in my magazines of choice and loved what I saw in the screenshots. Plus, Resident Evil 2 came on 2 discs, which meant I was practically saving money by buying it. I mean, you had to be crazy not to. I loved it. Zombies weren't overplayed at the time, it was nice and gory, and there were moments that scared the shit out of me and my mates. The 2 intersecting stories rewarded multiple playthroughs, as did all the rewards that got dished out depending on what rank you were awarded at the end of the game. My magazines assured me that you could play as a piece of tofu if you were good enough, but I'll be damned if I ever managed that. And then there was the story. A dodgy pharmaceutical company, corporate cover-ups, crooked cops. Resident Evil 2 offered up everything 15-year-old me wanted. I went back to play Resident Evil 1 to understand the backstory a little more, but it was the potential for future stories that had me excited. With hindsight, I'd become a fan of the series and a guaranteed customer of future titles. I suppose nowadays I'd be considered a member of the community, although we were just customers back then. As you can tell, I'm nostalgic for the good old days, and that may colour this review in ways I'm not able to identify. Resident Evil 3 came along nearly 2 years later, and while I enjoyed it a lot, deep down a part of me was disappointed at the lack of progression in the main story set up in the previous games. 3 didn't feel like a full sequel. After 3, the story gradually took a nosedive via prequels, spin-offs and just bad games. Even the good Resident Evil games, such as Resident Evil 4, had stories that were far too disconnected from the earlier events for my tastes. Resident Evil 2 remained my favourite Resident Evil game, even if I acknowledge that it isn't the best. In that sense, it was surpassed by 4 and then the remake of 1. As much as this level of nostalgia can colour a review in a positive way, it can have the opposite effect. I mean, how can any game have the same impact and elicit the same warm feelings I got all those years ago? Most of them don't. That was the case with the recent remakes of the Crash Bandicoot and Spyro games. I loved both of those trilogies back in the day, and the remakes are really good. Crash perhaps has some issues with hitboxes, but Spyro feels true to the original. I know some people have issues with differences in animations and storytelling in the remakes, but I'm not typically bothered by that in cartoony platformers. I enjoyed the remakes of both trilogies. They're a lot of fun. Crash 3 remains an excellent game, and all 3 Spyros are good collectathons. However, I never felt the highs I did when I played the originals. Of course I didn't. These are solid remakes of old games. Essentially, they have a new and expensive coat of paint on them. I've still played them before, and my tastes have changed a lot over the years. That's partly why I wasn't all that excited for the Resident Evil 2 remake. I suspected I'd enjoy it and have a good time, and I hoped it would remain faithful to the original, but that was it. I'm now going to sound like one of those YouTubers who gives an opinion after playing a game for an hour because they want the early clicks and then have to correct themselves a week later, but here we go. I was wrong about Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 2 somehow stays faithful to the original despite undergoing a huge change in gameplay style and visuals. It's a modern game with dated elements, except the dated stuff isn't a drawback. Elements like the puzzles are definitely of their time, but that doesn't mean they aren't enjoyable. This isn't like sticking with a live system long beyond the time they serve their purpose. I do not want to return to the days of having to start from the beginning of a game if I die to a final boss. I wouldn't mind a return to the days of desperately running around to find 3 medallions to open a secret door under a statue that leads to sewers underneath a police station, all the while being chased by Inspector Gadget on steroids. If you have any interest in survival horror games, then you should play Resident Evil 2. Future games in the genre will be compared to this one. This is the game to beat. Imagine playing FPS games in the early 2000s without having played Half-Life 2. Even if you aren't especially interested in the genre, you might want to give this a shot because it's friendly to newcomers and might convert even the skeptics among you. Don't worry if you haven't played the first game. As I mentioned, I played Resident Evil 2 before playing the first game. It wasn't a problem in the late 90s, and it sure as shit isn't a problem in 2019 where story summaries are a search away. All you really need to know is that Umbrella Corporation has been researching viruses, and one of those viruses has gotten loose in Raccoon City. You'll piece together the rest as you play. It's not rocket launcher science. You play as either Leon or Claire, who meet up early on at a gas station before being separated due to an unfortunate incident with an oil tanker. Whoever you choose to play as first, your goal is to make it to the police station to find help, although of course there isn't much help left to be had. From then on, your goal becomes to escape the city, which leads you all over the police station, through the sewers, and into Umbrella's lab. A single playthrough will likely only take you around 8 hours the first time, however you should definitely play it twice to see Claire and Leon's story. I'll discuss that more later. The environments are brought to life in a way that just wasn't possible before. In case you aren't aware, the original used fixed backgrounds which allowed for higher visual fidelity than we were used to, but also created a separation between the character and the environment. The fixed backgrounds looked incredible for the time, especially in screenshots, which is how most people would see the game before purchase. However, the fixed cameras made it hard to get truly immersed in the setting. You only ever saw things from that one camera angle the game wanted you to see. As a result, I have some oddly specific memories of the original. The best example I can think of is this small section in the reception area. I went through this door hundreds of times in the 90s, and this particular viewpoint is etched in my mind such that it's one of the first images I have when I think of the game. I don't, however, have particular memories of the reception area itself or where this room was located in the police station. It was just one of many areas that I ran through between loading screens. The remake brings the locations to life. No longer is the police station a bunch of stationary backgrounds. It's a complex maze of rooms, locked doors and dead ends that combine to create some of the best level design I've experienced in a while. I spent hours exploring this police station, learning which routes were clear of zombies, which had to be ran through at full speed, and which had to be crept through without a sound for fear of attracting the attention of Liqueurs. As you solve puzzles and find keys, you gradually open up new routes and rooms until you have access to nearly the entire station. Hours after I'd left the police station, I opened up a new shortcut that led back to the start in a way that reminded me of kicking down that ladder in Demon's Souls. This kind of connected level design adds so much to the experience when compared to games that don't bother, such as the Evil Within series. Backtracking certainly can be a negative, but not when it's done like this. Visually, the only negative of note concerns the lighting, mainly the rough transition between dark areas and light. Moving from an unlit area to a lit one looks more like someone has turned the lights on suddenly instead of a smooth change where the light from one room bleeds into another. While obviously a minor note, it is jarring as your eyes adjust to the different lighting. There's also a slight problem with dark blacks appearing as more of a dark grey than a black. I played on PC and couldn't try out HDR, so maybe it's better with that enabled. However, without it, there's definitely a lack of truly terrifying darkness that Terry Pratchett once described as the total absence of light. Even better than the locations are the enemies, who look incredible. I love the way they move. There's no consistency to their AI and they are relatively unpredictable in the best possible way. When they spot you, they'll make a general effort to head in your direction, but they don't have full control of their bodies. Sometimes they'll amble straight to you, but more often than not they'll be looking in your direction while walking off to the side, as if their brain, or whatever's left of it, hasn't managed to relay the message to the legs. It can look like the enemy AI has bugged out, however I doubt that's the case. This has to be deliberate. It's so cool to line up a headshot on a zombie that's looking straight at you while it walks into a cabinet. The unpredictability of the zombies is one of Resident Evil 2's greatest strengths. I got into the habit of avoiding zombies by keeping an obstacle between us, however some of them will simply throw themselves over desks to get at you instead of politely walking around like I'd hoped they would. There was one scene where I was in a basketball court with dogs barking on the other side of the fence. They couldn't get to me, so I took my time to pick up the ammo and other goodies, only for the dogs to clamber up the huge fence and fall over the other side before running at me. Nearly everything looks stunning. Birkin's transformations are horrific and yet impossible to look away from, and the visuals add a lot to certain jump scares that I won't spoil. Mr. X is appropriately intimidating, and yet there's also something humorous about the way he pokes his head around doorways. It manages that cheesy horror vibe that can be so tough to pull off. One thing that's thankfully less cheesy is the voice acting, which is a hell of a lot better this time. The writing is generally decent, and there are some excellent scenes involving side characters such as Marvin and the gun shop owner. Leon and Claire, however, have their fair share of dodgy lines. Leon is still spectacularly dumb for a cop, and even after hours of shooting zombies, Claire still wonders aloud about why people are walking around trying to bite her.
What is up with you? What the is up with you?
I don't demand Oscar-worthy writing in my horror games, but Claire's continued shock at the stupidest things was one of the most distracting parts of the experience. Resident Evil 2 is gory. I thought I'd become completely desensitized to this stuff, what with games like Doom and Mortal Kombat specialising in ridiculously over-the-top violence, and at times I actively dislike it. Resident Evil 2 front-loads some incredibly graphic moments which do feel a touch gratuitous, but for the most part the gore is there for a reason. Being able to shoot off legs and arms isn't just there to look shocking, it's a core part of how you're expected to play the game. You'll have to get used to it because shooting off legs is a lot more useful than going for the head. Early on you'll no doubt go for headshots only to realise that they don't do much good. The zombies in Resident Evil 2 are incredibly tough to kill, and even after 3 playthroughs I'm still not entirely sure how the damage system works. Here's my educated guess. Shots to the head don't necessarily do more damage than to any other part of the body, however there is a chance you'll get a critical hit which will explode the head for a permanent kill. This crit chance is fairly low with the starter pistol and higher with guns like the shotgun and magnum. You can improve your chances by aiming for a few seconds before shooting and letting the reticule shrink to focus on your target. Even so, the chances of blowing off their heads are slim. That's not to say headshots aren't worthwhile. They're good for staggering enemies which can be just as useful as a kill if you don't need to return to the area. For my money, the best tactic by far is shooting off a leg or two, perhaps even an arm as well if you feel like it. Even then, zombies will keep coming for you even if they only have one remaining limb, and they can still pose a genuine threat, especially around doorways. Their inability to get through a door once they've been reduced to crawling along the floor is generally a good thing, except when you forget they're there and stroll through a door only to get instantly bitten on the ankles. A favoured tactic of mine is shooting off one leg and one arm. That struck a decent balance between slowing them down and making it harder but not impossible for them to grab me. If you do get grabbed, you can use a counter item such as a knife, flashbang or grenade if you have them in your possession. I'm always tempted to use these immediately when grabbed, however I recommend not using flashbangs or grenades unless you're really low on health. You might be better off taking the hit. Knives are great for counters because they can be reclaimed from zombies once you've knocked them down, but they degrade a little too quickly for my tastes. You will likely get grabbed by zombies a lot, although I found health items to be far more prevalent than ammo, so I wouldn't worry too much if you take the odd bite. I've thought a lot about whether Resident Evil 2 would be better for having some kind of dodge mechanic, one that's tricky to pull off and requires perfect timing but lets you avoid a grab. Obviously, if this were to be implemented, there would need to be a corresponding reduction in the number of health items. Getting caught by zombies is one of the few areas that often detracts from the experience more than it adds to it. There are rough transitions between gameplay and the canned animations which play out when you're grabbed, which are particularly noticeable with the larger enemies such as the ones in the sewer. They completely block your path, and although I could occasionally clip through them without taking damage, I would usually get hit in the process. I tried grenades and flashbangs, however even when stunned it can be tricky to get past these things. Sometimes you'll clip through them, other times you'll have to eat the damage. It's also a little odd how you can stop and do puzzles even if a zombie is only a second away from grabbing you. You can't save your game at the typewriters when enemies are nearby, and it would have been better to apply a similar rule to interacting with puzzles. A particular favourite among the enemy types is the Liqueurs, who are blind, which in theory means you can sneak past them, however it's often not that simple. First you have to know they are there. This is typically signposted by a lot of blood on the nearby walls and floor, but in the heat of the moment you might miss the clues. If Liqueurs get a whiff of you, they'll come down to the floor and block your way, forcing you to either take another route or stun them and run past them if you have the right weapons and ammo. You won't always have the option to slow down and sneak past them. Once you start getting chased by Mr. X, you'll need to keep moving, Liqueurs or no Liqueurs. It's not a simple case of figuring out how the Liqueurs work and then playing around that. The game always throws new situations at you to keep you on your toes. Speaking of Mr. X, he is absolutely incredible here. You've probably already seen the GIFs and DMX mashups, and you'll almost certainly have a few GIF-worthy meetings of your own. The moment when he first lifts up the crashed helicopter and slowly walks towards you is stunning, and there was an unforgettable jump scare that I won't spoil. Mr. X continues to stalk you around the police station, his strangely loud footsteps and ever-present haunting sound in the background as you wander around solving puzzles. He refuses to enter certain rooms, typically save rooms, although that only provides a temporary respite. You know you'll be seeing him again soon. There are so many things that Capcom needed to nail with this remake, and Mr. X was definitely one of them. It's a job well done. Another core aspect of the old school Resident Evil games is those quirky puzzles that have you placing books in statues' hands and plugging chess pieces into electrical sockets. Maybe I'm just looking at this all through blood-tinted glasses, but to me these puzzles are more charming than they are dated. And hey, there is actually a vague attempt to contextualise it all this time, because we're told that the police station used to be an art museum. I'm not necessarily sure that explains the quirkier puzzles, but it's better than pretending this is a normal police station. None of the puzzles are especially difficult so long as you don't forget that you can turn the page in a book you find early on, which definitely didn't happen to me. The most challenging puzzle was inventory management, which I usually absolutely despise, but it wouldn't be a Resident Evil game without it. You start with only 8 inventory slots, and everything from guns to keys takes up at least 1 slot. You spend a ridiculous amount of time deciding whether to take that flashbang you found and risk not being able to take a puzzle piece you need later on. You can dump items in large crates dotted around, but getting to those crates presents a risk. It can feel a little silly at times. A keycard takes up the same amount of space as a pistol, and a wristband takes up space even though you're wearing it on your wrist. All this inventory management probably sounds tedious as all hell, but it's an absolutely crucial part of the experience, and I wouldn't give it up for anything. I might make a few minor changes though. I'd like to be able to drop items and come back to get them later, even if you have to drop items in the exact places that you pick up other stuff. For example, there was one particularly silly situation where I needed to pick up a cog and put another cog that was in my inventory in its place, except I couldn't take that first cog because my inventory was full. It's just a shame there isn't an option to swap pieces in situations like this. These slight niggles are unlikely to cause any major headaches, especially because this remake is easier than the original. There are excellent quality of life changes, such as being able to see when you've completely cleared a room by looking at the map and getting markers for any items you've left behind. On the normal difficulty setting, you get infinite saves at the typewriters littered around, and there are generous auto-saves as well. I know this will upset a few purists, but I'm fine with it. Dying and replaying a huge chunk of content is rarely a positive in my book. It's nice to know that if I die at a boss, I won't have to go through a load of inventory management before repeating a trek back to a boss room. If you do prefer the ink ribbon system, which requires you to find an ink ribbon to save your game, then hardcore mode is for you. There's also an easy mode complete with aim assist, although most people should stick to normal for a first playthrough. I found normal well balanced for both of my first 2 runs. I was typically low on ammo and health, but always just about had enough. I suspect there's a variable difficulty curve at work behind the scenes, adjusting how much ammo you get and the likelihood you'll deal crits. However, I haven't played it enough to say for sure. Hardcore mode grants you better rewards on completion, however I prefer to chase rewards after I've already got what I want from the story. The first time you play, I recommend you take your time and soak in the atmosphere without an eye on the clock. While on the subject of how you should play the game, I want to briefly discuss all the A route and B route stuff because I saw a lot of conflicting explanations around release, and certain publications made a bit of a hash of explaining it. I've seen people on the extreme ends claiming that Resident Evil 2 is a roughly 8-hour game that you play once, or at the other end that you need to play it through 4 times. The truth is somewhere in between. You choose between Leon and Claire for your first playthrough, which is referred to as the A route. Both characters play through the same environments and solve most of the same puzzles, however they meet different people along the way and go to locations that the other doesn't. It'd be disingenuous to describe these as 2 completely separate playthroughs or imply that only playing one is missing out on 50% of the game. However, you'd also be doing yourself a huge disservice if you stopped playing after completing Route A once. Let's say you pick Leon for your first playthrough. After completing the Leon A route, you unlock the option to do a second run as Claire, referred to as Claire B, or vice versa of course. This is not the same as starting a new game as Claire, which would be Claire A. This is where things get a bit confusing because in some ways the Claire B route is presented as seeing what happened from Claire's perspective while Leon was off doing his thing in the police station, except that's not the case at all. Most of Route B is the same as Route A. You skip some stuff at the beginning, but otherwise you retread the same ground. Completing Route B is necessary to unlock the true ending, which is why I recommend you do it in addition to getting some new content. Once you've done an A route and a B route, you can switch things up and do the same again the other way round. This doesn't offer enough variety to make it worth playing for the sake of new content, however this is where you should consider going for higher rankings or perhaps upping the difficulty to hardcore. Or both. Getting S ranks unlocks new weapons with infinite ammo for use in future playthroughs, so it's well worth doing. In fact, Resident Evil 2 constantly dishes out rewards for completing playthroughs such as old school costumes and even bonus modes that let you play as a piece of tofu. The wealth of content on offer is ridiculous, with free DLC now available as well. Throughout my time with Resident Evil 2, I was always aware of the passion the developers clearly had for the project. You can feel the love and care and attention to detail in every scene. That's not to say other developers don't put in the same level of effort, it's just that it shines through more here. There are even awesome little callbacks to the original which had a misspelled welcome sign in the police station. It's now spelled correctly, but there's an extra L on a nearby desk. I'm always reluctant to throw around high praise and label games as the best the genre has to offer. Games tend to be overhyped on release and then the love dies down over a few months and you end up looking a little stupid. I have absolutely no reservations about the high praise I've doled out for Resident Evil 2, nor the label as the best survival horror experience of its kind. I'm also not one for replaying linear games all that often, and yet as I write this, all I want to do is go and start a 5th playthrough of this game. There's a lot of hyperbole in games media these days, especially on YouTube. Everyone needs a catchy thumbnail, so games either have to be the best thing ever or the worst thing ever with no room in between. There's a lot of success to be had on YouTube by telling gamers exactly what they want to hear, and you'll likely have a lot of success by confirming that people have made good purchasing decisions. Here's the thing though, Resident Evil 2 really is that good. It actually is genre defining. It is one of the best AAA experiences I've had in years, and it will be in contention for my game of the year. You can believe the hype this time. Resident Evil 2 is phenomenal. Okay, that's it from me today. Be sure to like, share and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and let me know what you thought in the comments. I also have a Patreon if you'd like to support the channel financially. You get your name in the credits and a Patreon role in my Discord server for $1 a month. Keep an eye out for reviews of Crosscode and Metro Exodus, which should be coming soon. I'm going to go ahead and confirm that the Mass Effect 3 video will slip to March. The house move took up more time than I expected, and that video is far too important for me to rush. Until next time, cheers.